Why food banks and thrift stores are destroying the economy. There is no greater sign of a failing economy than the proliferation of food banks and thrift stores. There is no greater evidence that the economy is unstable than a growing need for free stuff. When people cannot buy what they produce, the economy is heading towards the cliff. If your town has a food bank, your town is in trouble. If your town has a food bank and a thrift store, be prepared for an economic downturn. If the food bank and thrift store business is booming, it is best you get out of the area, as fast as you can. When the largest economic sector is second-hand stores and free outlets, it is likely the town is headed for an economic downturn, if not collapse. It's nice to be nice. Everyone loves to give to charity. Women get a sense of purpose when they extend a helping hand to a needy neighbor, especially if they are childless. Women tend to enjoy participating in events that give them an outlet for their nurturing skills. But caring for a child is productive and rewarding. Caring for adults when they are able to care for themselves, is enabling at best and crippling at worst. Thinking food banks is a solution to the inability to buy food, is like buying an ice cream cone for an obese child, to cheer them up. It only makes the problem worse. At minimum, food banks increase the price of food. At worst, they enable a corrupt and evil system to remain in power. It is not that waste is a good thing or ought to be tolerated. But the need to reduce waste is not best met by externalizing it on the poor. Putting used goods into the homes of an underclass instead of a dump misses the point. People do not exist to serve as a buffer against the exhaustion of landfill sites. We must not look at this discussion as a diatribe against helping the unfortunate. There is no moral rule against helping the less fortunate. The problem goes deeper than this and calls into question the very fabric of society. Why do the poor exist? We can rightfully rail against the existence of food banks and thrift stores, but not because of the intent they represent, but because of the quality of the intent. Those who operate food banks are throwing life preservers to the drowning, when the problem is the people who want to keep the ship free of the uncultured. We are not to be praised for throwing the drowning a life vest but condemned for allowing people to remain in the water when they need to be rescued. Handing our more and more food and accessories to the needy is not solving the problem of their need. But if we are certain only 5 persons ought to be in a lifeboat, it might seem reasonable to deny access to those who need to be saved. But the economy is not a life raft, and it cannot be reasonably compared to one. Every man born was born with a head and 2 arms. Everyone alive has a capacity to work. We may decry the impoverished for being a drag on the economy, but what of the wealthy, the entitled, and those who work in government? Why is it a bigger crime to subsist on welfare than to live off a government make-work job? Why is a minimum wage a bigger problem than marketing boards and subsidies for corporations? If we balk at handing out food stamps and welfare checks to the impoverished, why are we not concerned about letting landowners, government officials and the like, getting paid for doing jobs that do not need doing? What is a landlord other than a man who lives off of the labor of others? Forget the arguments justifying what he is doing. The point is, were every landlord that exists to disappear, would the world be worse off, perhaps better off? Banks make a job out of lending money and collecting interest payments. Is the planet made better off by debt? The state creates jobs out of making rules that need to be regulated and of course, talked about at length. But do law-abiding citizens need laws, or criminals? The law makes people into criminals, but how does this help the world? Would it not be better to forego the laws and eliminate the criminals? But does anyone ask what good does the state do for the nation? If the nation was a commercial enterprise, would it have a department of the state? Does any of the things a government does create a profit for the national economy? But the government argues that the government is needed to build things for the government. Things like roads, schools and courthouses are often mentioned. The government builds none of these things, the private sector builds everything. Private citizens staff and operate all of the institutions of the state. So, what is the state and what does it really do? The state is private citizens who operate a charity. Canada is a charity. The United States is a charity. England and all other nations are charities. The state is the people operating these charities. Like all charities, the resources it needs to provide the goods and services it contends people cannot provide themselves. Food banks argue people cannot afford to buy food. But by buying food to distribute, free food banks keep the price of food high. No one loves food banks more than grocery stores because it ensures everyone is buying food, directly or indirectly through charities. Demand is high so prices can be kept high. The state argues the needy public are not able to build roads, so they tax us to get the money to build the roads they say we need. But it is our money and our labor that builds them. It is true, as the state asserts, the public do not have the systems in place to fund and build roads. But we no longer have the facilities for taking care of the unemployed and antisocial, because the state has usurped the job. But the question remains, if the best way to provide food is through soup kitchens and food banks, or not? If not, then we ought to ask if the best way to provide roads, sewers and policing is through charities, such as the state. Ought these things be free or provided as a public good at public expense, or is there a free market pathway through which these things can be supplied? It is an interesting question because, of course, these things are already supplied privately. There are even private armies, let alone private security forces, private roads and private schools and hospitals and all of the other things charity supplies. If too much government is no good for the market, then private charities are no solution either. If government disrupts the market because it deprives the market of the signals it needs to allocate resources correctly, then charities do the same thing. If people are unemployed and unable to buy food, how can the market adjust to this reality, if charities and the government are permitting people to stay unemployed and live without buying food or paying rent? If the system is not working well, the solution is not to protect it from itself. If a theory does not solve the questions it was supposed to answer, why create workarounds that will hide its failings? If any need, the system we are in is failing its most basic obligation. If we must deprive people of what is rightfully theirs, to protect the system from its failures, we are multiplying the problem, not solving it. Food banks solve the immediate problem of hunger, and in reality, this might be something that needs to be done in the short term. But it ought to be done with the realization we are making ourselves part of the problem and in fact, enabling a problematical situation to continue, and indeed, to become much worse. The problem is easier to see on a smaller scale. If we had a small colony of 10 persons and 3 had no job so that the other 7 needed to support them, we would see there is a serious problem with the colony. If the 7 were producing large surpluses, the situation might be sustainable. But what if over time more and more benefits were added to those the 3 unemployed were getting? What if, as the population grew, the ratio of unemployed to employed worsened, even as the level of benefits were increased? Ideally, the economy is a zero-sum game. What I produce is equal to what you produce, and when exchanged, the credits and debits zero each other out. Charity ought not to be akin to enabling. Charity helps those who cannot help themselves. But if our help disables the other person, that is not being charitable. We think the best of others, not the worse. We ought not to assume the other person is incapable of being useful. Charity ought not leave one half of the equation stronger than the other. Charity certainly must not be done in a way that debilitates the economy and undercuts the free market.